Kick off here.
Sorry about that.
Sorry about that.
Okay, let's kick off. Often put at the start to make people think, oh, have some relevance to what we're talking about here. When it's prosperity, people are separated by a Gambian oral something from an African gentleman there. Smith, imperialism in the talk an awful lot about that, very important. Surplus value captured by firms in imperialist countries. It's one of the great works in Western literature, in my view, but I don't get out very often. So, capital needs to meet the globe for untrammeled, not managed without the natural resources and the labour power territories. Now, again, this will be something of a leitmotif. What the hell is this? This is a map from 1370. Catalan. Any idea who that might be?
Mansa Musa.
That's it. Mansa Musa, a serious petinavanti from that particular time. Kingdom of Mali. Yes, please, Daniel. Okay. So, Catalan Atlas from 1375 CE. Emperor of Mali sits on a resplendent throne offering a North African trader a gold nugget. Now, there's various trade routes there across the desert, the peninsula. Knowledge and the famous pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to Mecca, which his fabulous gold wealth was displayed ostentatiously and very expensively. In fact, he never really recovered from the amount of gold he gave away on that trip. He relied on long-standing trade routes linking Jewish communities in Algeria.
Excuse me, we can't hear you. Could you please do something? We can't hear you.
Hold on a second, do I need to sit down?
No, I don't know if that's the case. Do you want to just play around with the audio? Oops. Oh, you want to try this one? Yeah. And try it now.
Is that any better now? Can you hear me?
We don't know yet because your voice keeps coming and going.
Check it in the chat if it's
You need to stop looking at the screen. When you look at the screen, we can't hear you on Zoom.
Is this a directional mic? I see, yeah.
So if I sit down like this, I don't mind sitting down here and I'll just share the screen with you.
Is that any better? Right.
Well, it might be good so far. We don't know yet.
Can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. It's much better when you're sitting down.
Right then, okay, I will stay sat down.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Right, so I'll go back and kick off from the start of this slide then. Sorry for you guys here in person. Okay, the Catalan Atlas from 1375, an incredibly detailed representation of various trade routes around at the time. Now, the cartographer, Crest, he designed the map based on travelers' knowledge and the famous pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to Mecca in 1324 and 1325, an incredibly expensive one because he gave away an awful lot of gold on the area. Now, there were various links between Jewish communities in Algeria and Morocco with the West African kingdoms, and again, Jewish communities in Iberia. It's important to note at this stage, this was a relationship among equals, and the map is the product of centuries of exchange between those equals. Toby Green, in A Fistful of Shells, a very recommended book about the development of Africa, cities of the Mediterranean world, such as Cairo, Lisbon, Sevilla, and Tripoli, did not impose themselves on West Africa and dominate their peoples. Instead, West African and Mediterranean societies, they emerged like the Atlas through trade and reciprocal exchanges. Okay, next slide, please. Say equals, they weren't quite equal. According to a Time magazine 2015 estimate, Mansa was the richest guy in world history, pound for pound, ever. And when you look at the mosque in Timbuktu, okay, this was built in his orders and was part designed by an Andalusian architect. Andalusia, of course, at the time was a Muslim province. Testament to the rising power of this state and its massive global connections, ahead of much of Europe at that stage. Mali today, like most of its neighbors, is one of the poorest countries on the planet. So, what happened? It was a very unequal society, and this, of course, fostered internal division, resentments grew, and this happened across Africa at the time and led to various internecine conflicts. With this growing conflict among and within these African states, there were more captives emerged that could be sold into slavery. The demand for slaves rose as Portugal, Britain, and France needed more labor to work their sugar plantations. Climate change, interestingly, was also a major factor in the 17th century. The increased uncertainties deriving therefrom drove accelerated conflict and contributed to the growth in the supply of enslaved persons. Now, it's important to remember gold was originally a fundamental driver of the original trading relationships that developed among European and West African nations in particular. In return for this hard currency export that did hold its value over time, the West Africans got copper, cowrie shells, and cloth, currencies whose values all declined significantly over time. These imports added value to Europeans as they boosted the manufacturing base. We'll go and talk about this a little bit more. The Marx Memorial Library, if we didn't talk about surplus value, and it's an important thing here. The young men that produced surplus value, young men in particular, they had their productive labor stolen and placed within the ambit of European empires. In the Senegambia region in the 17th century, iron bars were about 50% of the value of imports from Europe. Now, they didn't invent this, the Europeans, they exploited an already existing trading pattern in manufacturing base. The local smiths in the area were extremely skilled in turning the metal into tools and weapons. And later on in the New World, these African abilities to work metal became vital to the equipment that made a plantation actually function. Because as someone said before, labor is the source of all value.
Yeah.
Yours is working okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to switch off and come in.
Right, can people go on mute, please, whenever they're listening? Sorry, guys, stick yourself on mute. So, Africa, gold and silver was often melted down and wore in clothing and used as a ritual gift. That gold and silver that ended up in Europe constituted a growing basis for exchange, capital, and that went with the accrual of military power. Now, using currency to be transformed into goods with a practical or a socially cohesive value, such as cola nuts, meant that the store of capital value was actually lost. Individuals were accumulating social power and respect with generous donations of colas, but there was no accumulation of capital, which was to later on which would aid future development. This proliferation of currencies with practical and social value, cloth, iron, colas, meant they weren't increasing the store of transferable wealth, but they were becoming more dependent on the exchange mechanisms of that global market. Thank you. Dutch West India Company. Assets grew from 6.4 million guilders at 1600 to over 40 million in 1660. This after giving out 62 million guilders to shareholders. The Dutch textile industry barely, it shrunk to nothing. Production in Leiden expanded from zero in 1580 to over 100,000 pieces per annum in 1630. Many of those pieces destined for West Africa, which again put pressure on that area's indigenous industries. The English, and it was the English in those days, it wasn't Britain, exchanged slaves for iron bars and copper. Now, those slaves built the plantation economies. The copper smelting industry that developed in Bristol in the 1680s reaped huge profits from the exports to the Gold Coast, as did the iron industry. These were developments that helped propel the nascent industrial revolution. Now, some African rulers encouraged imported materials, particularly cloth, because it minimized purchases from potential local competition and was easier to control and take a cut. And what happens in Africa today may be that things haven't changed that much. So by increasing their own power in this way, they undermined their own local industries. Now, you had powerful states such as Benin that resisted the slave trade, and they built various institutions from trading cloth, based on trading cloth, from, amongst other people, the Dutch. As that sugar revolution took off in the Dutch and English Caribbean, the price of slaves rose 200% between 1685 and 1703, about as much as the price of things are rising in the UK right now. The Dutch lost interest in Benin cloth, and the supply of cowries dried up, and the kingdom began to participate in the slave trade in order to maintain their institutions and some sort of stability. The lessons there, which should have been learned, dependence on external trade for your money supply does have consequences. Now, it's actually difficult to overstate how important Africa and its enslaved persons were for the development of capitalism, though many have tried to for centuries. 1944, Eric Williams, who later on became the Prime Minister of Trinidad, published a seminal Capitalism and Slavery. Now, as Howard French notes in Born in Blackness, a very recommended book again, Western scholars put more energy into attempts to find fault with or outright debunk his arguments than they'd ever previously invested in considering the possibility that Africa and Africans played an important role in the story of Europe in the first place. Now, with the Williams book, but modern research has substantiated the essence of his arguments. Pomerantz, The Great Divergence, Europe, China, and the Waking of the World Economy. Again, recommended, though it's not exactly fun. You can probably guess that from the title. He credits two main factors for Europe's British-led ascent. Taken over the Americas, integrated many millions of square miles of good agricultural land, and Europe's expropriation of African labor that made the sugar and cotton industries possible and profitable. Let's go. So English exports were led by wool from the 14th century. Demand was limited by, again, restrictions and also increasing competition from the French. Now, tropical markets, whether in the New World or Africa, couldn't replace European demand because wool wasn't really that, wasn't suitable for hot climates. The takeoff of England was contingent on overcoming the limitations of wool-based growth, which it achieved through the new American Atlantic markets made possible by slavery and sugar. So very basically put here, English manufacturers went to North American markets that were so rich, they quickly overtook Europe. The colonies financed this trade with England by selling a wide range of their own goods to the British and French Caribbean. This was called the triangular boom, and it relieved England of the need to devote so much of its lands to sheep. All this was built on African slavery. Now, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology study was published 5 years after Pomerantz, and it showed that the growth differentials between Western Europe and other regions during this period almost entirely accounted for by the growth of nations with access to the Atlantic Ocean or the Atlantic traders. So this study says the rise of Europe is consistent with theories that emphasize the importance of profits made in the Atlantic trade, colonialism, and slavery. Let's go. So this also, the MIT study also talks about the direct effects and the indirect effects, the social transformation induced by these opportunities. They altered the balance of political power by enriching and strengthening commercial interest outside the royal circle. Through this, it contributed to the emergence of political institutions protecting merchants against royal power. Now, a quote here, many of you will recognize from a writer that doesn't need any introduction. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. So, again, Marx Memorial Library, we had to have something from the guy in there. Let's now look at Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton, A New History of Global Capitalism. This again revealed the importance of cotton and violence to the growth of Atlantic capitalism, or war capitalism, as he called it. Cotton was hugely important. 1830, 1/6 of all Britons were employed in textile production. 1 million Americans, mostly slaves, 1/13 of the population worked in cotton farming. Now, cotton's a very labor-intensive business and a very hard way of making a living. Getting enslaved persons to do it made economic sense. And also sugar. Working in sugar was a hell of a tough job. You wouldn't have got people to do that unless they were paid an awful lot of dosh. So slavery was absolutely fundamental to the development of these two incredibly important industries. 1850 and 1860, more than half of US exports consisted of cotton from the southern states. This wouldn't have been possible without European capital investment. That needs to be remembered too. Yes, please. The fate of the South in the American Civil War. Great Britain had more reason to pursue the expansion of its empire in the years following that war, as they had to find other sources of raw cotton. Egypt, case in point here, there was a big cotton famine because of the problem with the American Civil War and the aftermath. The Ottoman Viceroy of Egypt turned it into a major producer of cotton through a wave of coercion and violence. It wasn't just the British Empire used coercion and violence. Ownership of vast swathes of lands transferred from villages into the hands of landlords of large estates. By 1864, of all fertile land in Lower Egypt had been converted to cotton agriculture. The state took out large loans, mainly from the City of London, built new railways, canals, and cotton processing plants. Now, as the price of cotton slumped after the Civil War, the country went bankrupt. The Brits moved in, invaded 1882, and took political control of the country. Thereafter, the British used their new laws on debt and property, backed up by military force where necessary, to compel Egyptians to grow ever more cotton. India took two separate blows as a result of the cotton trade and the imperial power connected therewith. Late 18th century, big demand for cotton cloth from India to trade for slaves in Africa. European capitalists wanted to replace Indian manufactured cloths with their own. This was partly achieved by increasing productivity of labour through mechanization, but that wasn't enough. So in 1665, they imposed an import duty on imported Indian cloth, and in 1714 decreed that cotton cloth sold in England had to be made exclusively from cotton spun and woven in England. So when people say the British Empire and British prosperity was built on free trade, it's tosh. Right. Debt became a powerful tool in British-controlled India, as indeed it had in Egypt. So India was now a former colony after the Indian Revolution, which the British call the Indian Mutiny, which is nonsense. It was a revolution/war of independence. The new rulers saw the opportunity to spread cotton growing after the fall of the South. Various infrastructure projects linked to cotton agriculture, roads and railways, financed by increasing local taxation, thereby forcing many peasants into the money economy, as they could only pay by producing cotton as a cash crop. Legal change allowed landlords and moneylenders to profit from the growth of cotton for export to Britain. The mass of the rural population plunged deep into poverty and debt. Cotton prices fell, food prices rose in the late 1870s. Over 6 million people died, not from shortage of food, this was no famine, but a shortage of any money to pay for it. Now, India takes us into the area of direct imperial imposition and indeed straightforward plunder and theft. Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire 2016 summed up the experience. 1600, when the East India Company was established, Britain was about 1.8% of world GDP, India 23%, 27% by 1700. By 1940, after nearly 2 centuries of the rise, Britain was 10% of world GDP. India was a poor, so-called third world country, destitute, starving. 16% literacy, a life expectancy of 27, no domestic industry, and over 90% living in some form of abject poverty. You look at shipbuilding. Indian shipping and shipbuilding industries were destroyed by the British. I read some book years ago, I think it was A Suitable Boy, where a character, is set in India, and a character says to another character, if we'd been able to build boats, we'd have built an empire as bad as the British. the Indians could build boats. The Bengal fleet in 1600 had around 5,000 ships. That figure increased into the mid-18th century. Now, to check on this competition, after 1857, the East India Company and the ships they contracted were given a monopoly on trade routes, including those used by Indians, and duties imposed on Indian ships are moving merchandise to and from Indian ports. That helped destroy the shipping industry. Calcutta was a major shipbuilding centre in the early 19th century, mostly British owned. Costs were lower, so a lot of British companies moved there to make decent ships that were actually more durable because the work was good and they used a better quality wood. British ships couldn't compete, so they passed acts in 1813 and 1814 that imposed weight restrictions on ships sailing between India and the UK. Ships the right to trade with Europe and the USA. As a result of this, Britain became the major shipbuilding power. So, why all the history? I think it's to show that exploitation of the periphery has always been fundamental to capitalism. Whether you call it informal or formal or informal imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, the ability to exert coercion, assert advantage and extract value from the periphery through a combination of economic and military power, it's a key element of capitalism then and now. Most of Africa in 1875 still run by Africans, albeit in a continent wounded by slavery. The Great Scramble in the latter part of the 19th century was motivated by competing empires and the search for new markets in response to the so-called Long Depression of 1873 to 1896. Now, that term's a bit of a misnomer. That period was more one of relative British decline because other countries such as Germany were rising. But the perception of depression certainly motivated the Brits to secure more markets and their competitors to reciprocate. The fears of a growing German economic, imperial and military might culminated in that Great War of 1914 to 1918. Noting one of the first major operations the Brits undertook was the securing of the oil fields in Basra in November 1914. The majority of the troops in that operation were actually Indian. The Great World War II, and after 1945, the world entered a period of so-called decolonization. But this didn't end exploitation of the periphery, nor the exercise of coercion. Far from it, it just looked a little bit different. Thank you. Next one. Now, capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. Lenin. Why does that still resonate? Now, let's start by looking at the economic imperialism exposed by John Smith. Imperialism in the 21st century, globalization, super exploitation, and capitalism's final crisis. Capitalism's final crisis has been forecast for a while, so I'm not too sure about that. Let's hope the guy had a point. He said, succinct and concrete definition of imperialism I can come up with: the subjugation of the entire world to the interest of the capitalist ruling classes of a handful of oppressor nations. Important to remember, it is a handful of oppressor nations here, the same people that have been doing this stuff for a long time. This contains both the economic and political dimensions of imperialism. Subjugation denotes the political subjection of governments, states, and peoples to imperialist rule, while interest of the capitalist ruling classes refers to their economic interests, essentially the appropriation of the lion's share of the surplus value generated by the workers and farmers of the world, not just by those resident in their own countries. Now, Smith looks at global value chains, GVCs, in this process. Basically, international production, trade, and investments are increasingly organized in these GVCs. Different stages of the production process are located across different countries. The reality of these chains is this: global buyers, and I used to work with some of these people, they're dreadful people, targeted with reducing costs. They force wages down to the very bottom. This means that developing country suppliers are forced to cut their overheads, forget safety, and make working conditions even worse. The corporates that sit on top of these supply chains can move their business easily to wherever they want to, so people supplying them are under massive pressure to cut the costs. And this does lead to death. 24th April 2013, The Rana Plaza in Dhaka, Bangladesh, collapsed. It housed 5 garment factories, over 1,000 people killed, and badly injured more than 2,500 people. Smith talks about this a hell of a lot in the book. UNCTAD, about 80% of global trade in terms of gross exports is related to transnational corporations, international networks. 3/4 of which are actually intermediate goods and services incorporated at various stages in the production process of goods and services for consumption. Now, interesting here, Stephen Roach of Morgan Stanley in 2004 wrote about what was then a quite growing phenomenon. Substitution of high-wage workers here with light-quality, low-wage workers abroad in an era of excess supply, or perhaps we might call it overproduction. Read Das Kapital if you have some time off. Companies lack pricing leverage as never before, and they must be unrelenting in their search for new efficiencies. Offshore outsourcing that extracts product from low-wage workers in the developing world has become an increasingly urgent survival tactic for companies in the developed economies. So, capitalism under profitability, under pressure, go overseas and extract even more surplus value from people who are paid very little and have little chance of fighting back, which became dominated by foreign TNCs. By 2003, they and the joint ventures accounted for about 80% of China's exports of industrial machinery, 90% of computers, components, and peripherals, 71% of electronics and telecommunications. In a minute. Now, unsurprisingly, it's the foreign TNCs that reap the super profits from exploiting Chinese workers. Foxconn here, they assemble products for Apple. Clear example. They made $2.4 billion in profits in 2010, or $2,400 per employee, compared to $263,000 in profits reached by Apple for each of its 63,000 employees, many of whom are still in the United States. So this is why China and other countries caught in the middle income trap need to move up the value chain. And one of the reasons why America worries about China. Let's go. Now, manufacturing value added. This is the real story we're talking about here. This is basically the value added in the manufacturing process. So it's the net output calculated after adding up all the outputs and subtracting the intermediate stuff. So it's basically the stuff that whenever you make stuff, it's the value that you add yourself rather than stuff which you've taken from other people. The global south, their share of the value of the final product is shrinking. Between 1990 and 2004, manufactured exports grew by 434%. That's the total of exports. Their combined value added grew by just 46%. That's because a greater proportion of the value of the exports is made by imported goods, as their manufacturing has become integrated into these global supply chains rather than satisfying domestic needs. 1990, the NVA of the 55 low and middle income nations surveyed by the World Bank was 1.8 times the value of their export and manufacturers. By 2002, this had fallen to 0.6. Mexico, between 1990 and 98, manufacturing exports increased by a factor of 10, total value added increased by barely 50%, and its share of world NVA actually fell. High-income nations were a mirror image over this period. Their ratio of NVA to manufactured exports actually doubled from 0 to 2 from 1990 to 2002. So, Southern manufacturing MVA growth exceeded their exports by a wide margin. Manufacturing was about satisfying domestic needs. An MVA for many southern countries, it's less than it was in the 1970s. They've expanded their share of global exports, but the share of global MVA has risen by proportionally much less because they're assembling stuff for other countries and they're taking in components from elsewhere. Everyone get that? Okay, cool. That's one place. Yes, Smith's conclusion. Copious evidence has been amassed that outsourcing or export-oriented industrialization, there's normally some euphemism at hand here, isn't a path to development or convergence with developed countries. On the contrary, extreme power asymmetries and race to the bottom competition results, in much of the proceeds of this expanded exploitation of low-wage labour being captured by imperialist firms and imperialist states. The global shift of production has fueled development of imperialist countries at least as much, probably more, as it's fostered development of the supposedly developing countries. They also have to deal with the hidden cost of development, damage to the environment and to workers' health. Is moving up the value chain, according to a pre-pandemic report by the FT. They're abandoning low-end goods to more middle-range goods. It's actually a very fast change, according to, forgive my pronunciation here, Zubin. Is that right? Is that okay? Yeah. Professor at the China Europe International Business School. Global capital market share rose from 5% in 2007, 20% in 2016. Now, multinationals continue to play a big part in China's exports. About 43% of the exports come from foreign invested companies, higher for high-tech products such as laptops, smartphones, and for large companies. 13 of the top exporting companies are foreign-owned, according to Chinese customs. Companies like General Electric, BASF, and US conglomerate Honeywell, they've opened more sophisticated plants in China in the past decade, sometimes at the expense of jobs in the United States. You may have heard some American politicians complain about that occasionally. Okay, next please. It's still a final assembly point for components made elsewhere, but that trade's fallen as a share of Chinese exports to about 35%. The domestic content's risen from 60 to 80%. But it still needs to import the components and the capital goods to make them. Imports from Germany nearly doubled in the past decade, but this ratio could fall quickly once Chinese firms master the techniques. But it's still behind in the real high-tech manufacturing. Barely any presence in export markets for chips, diesel engines, and passenger vehicles. So, Taiwan. 65% of the world's semiconductors and almost 90% of the advanced chips. China and Taiwan are mutually very dependent. China and Hong Kong together account for around 42% of China's exports, beg your pardon, Taiwan's exports, yeah. America about 15%. America is desperate to reduce Taiwan dependency and to impede Chinese chip development. It recently broadened bans on sales of chip making equipment. The idea is to cover a wide range of semiconductor equipment going to China. South Korea, a groveling US ally, has indicated it will also cut off the chip supply to China in case Washington imposed global sanctions. Cutting off supplies like this would put China and Russia at a major technological disadvantage and hamper their manufacture of military stuff. Yes, please. So, this use of American economic power to impose sanctions and conformity is one aspect of its imperial imposition on the modern world. It's a function of its relative economic heft. If that declines, then so does its ability to make sanctions work and enforce that conformity. India and China have refused to observe the sanctions on Russia, along with much of the planet. That's evidence of relative decline. If this threat of sanction becomes non-fatal to many economies, and alternative markets and investors exist, then the efficacy of sanctions on China could well be called into question, and American imperialism might become more aggressive. This is a country which needs to be economically, militarily, and psychologically number one, and of course slake the thirst of its fossil fuel and military industrial lobbies. The current war in Ukraine has been great for American arms and LNG exports, liquefied natural gas exports. It's also begun the whole process of ending Europe's reliance on Russian gas, something which the Americans have never been comfortable. A few years ago, whenever Russia did make some overtures about joining NATO, when they were shocked at NATO's expansion close to its borders, the Americans rejected those overtures because they didn't want Europe, particularly Germany, leaning towards Russia and away from the American sphere of influence. Okay, after that cheerful stuff, let's get back to Africa. Despite the end of formal imperialism, a continent still bled dry by rapine. Finland and South Korea, famous for Nokia and Samsung. Younger people here remember Nokia phones? Yeah, okay. Average life expectation in those countries is around 80. Democratic Republic of Congo, the home of the minerals which actually make these phones, you're lucky to get past 50. Resources account for about 11% of European exports, 12% of Asia's, 15% of North America's, 42% of Latin America's, and 66% of Africa's. 14% of the world's population, 43% of the world's poor. Burgess in The Looting Machine. Now, we've got an excellent book by a former FT journalist about how Africa has been completely taken apart. It's been modernized. Treaties signed at gunpoint dispossessed their inhabitants of land, gold, and diamonds. Today, it's lawyers, oil, and mineral companies. Okay, let's move on. We can talk about this. But I tend to use the slides as speaking notes and also as something which I can pass on to people to read afterwards. So if you're interested, let me know. So an example here of how this looting machine works. So you got a mine owned by the state or the rights to a virgin deposit. They get sold, often in secrecy, to an offshore network well below its worth. Then via a complex network of hazings and secrecy, the assets sold at a huge profit to a foreign mining company. Let's look at, let's call it SMKK, typically labyrinthine and venal. Joint venture between the Congolese state and a small Canadian company. They held the rights to land in the heart of the copper belt. At the end of this, the government stake was sold to an unknown company in the Virgin Islands, $15 million. They immediately sold the same rights for $75 million. $60 million lost to the state. Between 2010, 2012, Kofi Annan's Progress panel, they said that there was something like $1.36 billion lost, more than it received in humanitarian aid in the same period, for similar deals run by the same Israeli businessmen. Just 2.57% of the 41 billion generated by Congo's mining industry, went into the country's budget. Belgium's history in Congo was hideous. I won't go through that, but it was basically a sadistic ivory and rubber plantation belonging to the king. After 60, the Belgian government took it over, and Katanga is an extremely mineral-rich province. The Belgians encouraged secessionists to kill Patrice Lumumba in a CIA-sponsored coup that gave the Congolese people Mobutu, a vicious kleptocrat. Mobutu was welcomed by the United States. They thought the guy was great. Only after the end of the Cold War did they think he's no longer any use, and they got rid of the guy. This is a microcosm of the looting that takes place across the continent and is redolent of the original looting of Africa, mostly by private enterprise, tacitly supported by states concerned. I bet is it good for business. Unequal exchange, exploitation of conflict, and the greed of elements of the local elites are all things that help. Now a major player in Africa and has taken a different approach, or there will be continuing debate about the scale of the difference. In many ways, China's offered African states a hand. They've done stuff that other countries wouldn't do. The ambassador to Niger declared that industrialization is an unavoidable step for this country to escape from poverty. The Chinese came along and said, you want a refinery? What size? We'll go ahead and do it, according to Idi Ngo, the former Nigerian president of the Chamber of Commerce. Chinese funding 2/3 of Africa's spending on infrastructure. Interest rates a bit less than commercial banks, but slightly more than traditional donors like the World Banks. Now, Ngo makes, I think, a legitimate criticism of China and also expresses a huge problem for Africa as a whole. He said they should have insisted the Chinese use local labor and local operators for transit, etc. But they let the Chinese do what they wanted, and they didn't secure the skills and infrastructure to salve the resource reliance. Let's go. Diversification is central. Niger is acutely dependent on a handful of raw material exports. According to Ngo, if you let China do what it wants, they pay for all of the resources and they use Chinese labor and Chinese trucks. It's a big problem. They're coming here because the resources are here. This moment won't be repeated. We can't miss it. When the uranium or the oil is finished, they will leave. The governor of Nigeria's central bank, Sanusi, was equally trenchant. So China takes the primary goods and sells as our manufactured ones. This was also the essence of colonialism. The British went to Africa and India to get raw materials and markets. Africa is now willingly opening itself up to new forms of imperialism. Now, there's a debate to be had about this that might be uncomfortable for some of us, but we can't dismiss or ignore this experience and testimony of Africans. Importantly too, Danny Roderick, who's a very good economist on trade, the rise of newly industrialized China has made subsequent, crucial mass industrialization by anyone else more difficult. Okay, let's go. Now, it wouldn't be a good lefty presentation if we didn't slag off the European Union. So let's get that one in here now. 1953, Gallagher and Robinson published an article in the Economic History Review, The Imperialism of Free Trade. They argued basically that imperialism was all about, from the 19th century onwards, establishing access to markets on free trade terms favourable for the British, achieved through formal imperialism if necessary, but they prefer to do it by agreement and co-option of local elites. There's a certain point there. When you look at South America, the Brits never took it over formally, but they certainly had serious cooperation from local elites. Argentina basically agreed to open up its markets to British trade, to British industrial goods, and they sold the Brits commodities and beef. That's one of the reasons why these countries never really developed a good local indigenous industry. Now, the work remains controversial, but a successor volume was published in 2019, containing an interesting article condemning the EU as the archetypical constitutionally neoliberal bloc. Now, when you read the sentence there, I think you guys should be grateful for me. I read this sort of stuff so you guys don't have to. Okay, let's go on. Do I press that? Yeah, I can do it myself. Oh, cool. Right. So ensuring periphery dependence on commodity exports while taking imports from the developed world has always been a basic fulcrum of free trade imperialism. 2016, falling commodity prices damaged non-diversified African states dependent on exports, debt accumulation, and more aid dependence. In the 60s and 70s, when the periphery states had various import substitution policies in place, growth rates were twice those that applied during the more recent neoliberal period when the Washington Consensus took over. 2014, West African states initialed a regional economic partnership agreement with the European Union after 10 months of campaigning against it. 6 months later, Nigeria and Gambia refused to sign. The president of the Nigerian Manufacturers Association said the EPA would flood the country with cheap EU products, destroying what little industry there was left. Let's go. President of Nigeria, the current president, wrote an article in February 2022 in which he called for a new economic deal between the EU and Africa. Here he adumbrated some of the main elements of EU imperialism. Agricultural subsidies. It's not just the EU, but American agricultural subsidies as well. They screw large parts of Africa. More than 50 billion applied into keeping European food produce cheap. African countries deprived of foreign exchange, and investment in agriculture is stifled. Subsidy-driven surpluses of European milk, powdered, sent to Africa, decimates the dairy industry. Similarly, wheat poultry production. At the higher end of the value chain, premature trade liberalization demanded by these economic partnership agreements put nascent manufacturers out of business. Other cases, industries don't materialize. There's no incentive to even start. It's for these reasons that Nigeria decided against signing the EPA. Possible for them because its place as the largest economy in Africa and they got oil. Smaller nations don't have that choice. Evasion and avoidance run by the Brits, which cost, not just the Brits, but the Brits are pretty big at this. It costs low-income countries about $200 billion a year, more than $150 billion they get from aid. The EU has also come to be an imperial power in Europe. Its neoliberal constitutionalism, aligned with the new gold standard of the euro, has worked to ensure politics cannot override free market imperatives. Remember when Juncker was in charge and Syriza won the election in Greece, he said there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. The new Italian government, of course, I have no sympathy for them, but they have to send their new draft budget to Brussels by mid-October for approval. The totally independent ECB has delivered a couple of serious interest rate hikes lately, and they promised even more, which will complicate Italy's efforts to head off the threat of recession and reduce public debt. The Italians have got a long relationship with Russia, and whenever the pandemic kicked off, the Russians helped the Italians out more than the European Union did in the early days. They want to carry on Russian gas, but they don't have the practical national sovereignty that allows them to do so and defy the European Union. If they do leave the EU or the euro, they end up saddled with huge debts in a foreign currency. So the EU and the EU have people in it. German hegemony. Now, we'll talk very quickly about this because we're running out of time. Basically, after the dot-com bubble, German industry had a real problem. So they agreed to keep wage rises low and prices low to undercut a large part of the rest of Europe. This caused some of the serious imbalances that led to the crisis we had in 2008. This was a deliberate policy to increase their exports. The euro took away the ability of the other countries to devalue as a response to this German aggression. And here, any European entity seeking independence will have to think carefully about its relationship with the EU and the limits that organisation will place on its independence in or out. And yes, I do mean Scotland. Latin America. Now, Latin America is interesting in that Chile is now, beg your pardon, China is a major player there. They bought 25%, hold on. They bought 25% of Chile's main lithium producer. It's Chile's #1 trading partner and a major source of foreign investment. They also own a large part of the electricity grid. 2020, 1/3 of Chile's exports went to China, nearly 3 times the exports to America. Now, it runs a good trade surplus with China, but some sectors have recorded difficulty in competing with Chinese exports that were opened up by this 2005 trade agreement. Pompeo visited Santiago in 2009, denounced China's investment as corrosive, corrupt, and erosive of good governance. Chinese companies were engaged in espionage and China was not a reliable partner. Of course, America would never do anything like that. China's a major player across this very important part of the world. America and the EU's re-engagement, and they're both talking about that, will entail competition and potential confrontation. At the end, guys, so well done for getting this far. Let's talk about the lingering mindset, because I think this is important. Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism. If you have a quick read here, he ends up here. He basically talks about, he says that it's people don't like about the Nazis. It was the fact they did it against the white man. It's the humiliation of the white man. And the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria and the Berbers, the coolies of India and the blacks of Africa. I have no doubt myself that the British would be remembered as the great bastards of history had it not been for the Nazis. I think what Césaire is talking about here is that, basically white people underestimate just how hideous the empire was. Toni Morrison, the great American writer, nothing highlighted freedom for whites if it did not in fact create it like slavery. So there's evidence of racism prior to the age of European empires, but the disease really kicked off with empires. They had to justify the slaughter and enslavement of various peoples by casting them as less than fully human. Geniuses of Western thought, Immanuel Kant and Darwin fell to the disease. Kant was a hideous racist, and Google Immanuel Kant on black people and you'll be appalled by some of the stuff that seemingly decent philosophers said. This mindset manifests itself today in a set of attitudes that tell against working class unity and against any sense of solidarity or even common humanity with the downtrodden people in the global south. There's still a great feeling of superiority to people in developing countries. They believe those countries' problems are down to inherent cultural failings and a tendency to corruption and violence. Whenever the Ukraine war broke out, you had news reports from Brits and from Americans expressing shock that this was a war in which white Europeans were killing each other, not the usual internecine third world strife. Now, this is absurd given the fact that most of European history over the last couple of 100 years is about internecine wars where Europeans slaughtered each other. People to take in white Ukrainian refugees, brazen contrast to their hostility to refugees from other parts of the world. This is a particular bugbear of mine. The drugs trade, cocaine, heroin, you get a trail of dead bodies and enriched murderers across the planet. But respectable middle-class people here don't mind as long as they can feel good for a while. Also, I think that again, it appalls me in social media. You see people on the left saying Cromwell was our best ever, Britain's best ever prime minister. The effect on Irish people whenever they describe Cromwell such is hideous. Cromwell's record in Ireland was appalling. I think we have very close to here. The existence of starving millions of people, it serves to dull the anger felt by many at their fate in the global north. They think, hell, things aren't so bad for us after all. We aren't doing too bad compared to those third world people. It makes them resist parties as soft on immigrants, and they support facile attacks on international aid. As per Toni Morrison, slavery made white people appreciate their freedom more. It helped to afford a sense of superiority and paranoia that still dominates American politics. All this is going to have to change if we're going to avoid major conflict. Demographics always get you, and it's neglected by many economists. Africa's population is projected to grow from 1.5 to 2 billion by the middle of this century. Some projections suggest that Nigeria's population could outstrip that of Europe, and that's Europe including Russia and Turkey, before the end of the century. The fate of these people will affect us all, particularly if the current trajectory of the continent remains unchanged. This will have potentially catastrophic consequences for the environment and any political stability. And we're all going to have to get used to living and working with more Africans, particularly in demographically challenged Europe. I've been traveling a lot in Europe lately. This is an old continent. You look at the average age in Germany, it's about 48. Austria, it's about 46. Italy, it's even more. We're going to have to go ahead and get more immigration to keep things going. We need to return to the respect that was shown in the Catalan Atlas for Mansa Musa, and forget all the tendentious historical inaccuracies and nonsense that we've been fed for centuries to render our momentary dominance appear inherent rather than something which is contingent and fundamentally the outcome of plunder. That's it. Sorry it was so long.
I'm going for audio, let me just grab that.